again, everyone. Thanks for joining us again for our class. This is the penultimate class in our series of studies on the history of the Jews from around the New Testament period, just before and just after. And today we've come to what you may call the climax of the activities in that period, an event that is probably one of the most traumatic events in the history of the Jews. This is the First Roman War and the destruction of Jerusalem, which took place in AD 70. And so we're going to talk about that, and we're going to hopefully share some thoughts with you that would allow us to learn some things that will help us in our lives today. Remember, at the end of our last class, we talked about when the rebellion broke out in Jerusalem and the response, the initial response of the Romans. Nero, who was emperor at the time, as we said, contacted the governor, the ruler of Syria, and had an army led by a man called Cestius Gallus and the 12th Legion. They went down to Jerusalem to quell the rebellion and control the Jews. And so I just want to add one part of that story which I left out last time deliberately because I want to save it for this class. But there's an element to that story that I want to add and to share with you today. So Cestius Gallus comes down with his 20,000 soldiers in his 12th Legion, and they surround Jerusalem in a siege format, as we mentioned last time. So if you were a Christian living in Jerusalem at this time, you would look around and you would notice that Jerusalem is now surrounded and compassed with armies. And that phrase, Jerusalem compassed with armies, if you are familiar at all with the New Testament, that should ring a familiar bell to you. Because that is a phrase that is used by the Lord Jesus when he was prophesying this exact series of events, and in particular found in the Gospel of Luke chapter 21. And the Lord made a very specific prophecy to his disciples and to those who were listening at the time. And I'll read that prophecy for you right now because it's very important to our story. So in Luke chapter 21 and verse 20, again, the Lord Jesus is telling his disciples about the things that would happen just before the destruction of the temple. And he was giving them a sign. And this is the sign he gave them in verse 20. And he said, "And when ye shall see Jerusalem compassed with armies, then know that the desolation thereof is nigh." Verse 21 says, "Then let them which are in Judea flee to the mountains, and let them which are in the midst of it depart out. And let not them that are in the countries enter thereinto." We'll come back to that shortly. And then verse 22 says, "For these be the days of vengeance, that all things which are written may be fulfilled." That's Luke chapter 21 from verse 20 to 22, the words of the Lord Jesus. And imagine that. Here you are now. Imagine you are a Christian and you are in Jerusalem and you see the words of the Lord Jesus coming to pass. Jerusalem is now compassed by armies. And what was the instruction? Well, when you see it, get out. Flee to the mountains. Don't let anyone come into the city. In other words, do the opposite. Flee from the city. And you probably thought as a Christian, this is it. This is what the Lord said we should do. We should flee from the city because it's now compassed by armies. And then your next thought would be, but wait a minute. The city is compassed by armies. How can we flee? We can't leave. We can't get out because the armies literally have us boxed in to the city. They're surrounded. We are in a siege. We can't leave. So how did the Lord tell us that when we see the armies surrounding the city that we should leave? And you as a Christian in that first century were probably a bit confused at that time. But if you recall the story that I gave last class, at the end of last class, remember what I said. That Cestius Gallus, the general in charge of the army at that time, entered Jerusalem, and after a siege of about 9 days, for reasons that we are not totally clear on, he decides he's going to end the siege and retreat. And he does that. He just ends the siege, gets his army together, and heads off, presumably back to Syria. And now you can imagine the response of the Christians, because they saw the words of the Lord Jesus being fulfilled. And he said, when you see the armies flee from Jerusalem. And no, this was their chance. The siege was broken up. Cestius Gallus had left. This is now their chance to flee. And flee they did. Christians in their numbers fled Jerusalem and left and fled to the hills, just as the Lord said. Some people say that eventually many of them ended up in Antioch, but that's a story for another time. But the point is, they fled. They left Jerusalem, and at that point, there were very few, if any, Christians left in Jerusalem, because they all heeded the words of the Lord Jesus. And so now, all the Christians are gone from Jerusalem. And you recall the story that I gave last time? The Jewish rebels pursued after Cestius Gallus and inflicted an embarrassing defeat of them, killing about 5,000 Roman soldiers and stealing all their equipment, stealing their supplies. And it was quite embarrassing to Cestius Gallus and his men. The Romans had never suffered such a defeat previously. And again, Cestius Gallus returned home in embarrassment, a failure, having failed to subdue the rebellion. Nero, emperor back in Rome, hears all this and decides that now it's time to get serious. Obviously, this was a task that was well beyond Cestius Gallus. He now has to call in a real general, an experienced general. And he does so by calling in a Roman general by the name of Vespasian. Vespasian, who eventually becomes an emperor as well. But at this point, he's a general, very successful in pursuing other wars on the behalf of Rome. And Nero calls him to come and deal with these Jews once and for all. So now, Vespasian enters Israel with 60,000 soldiers, and he is coming to take the battle to the Jews. But Vespasian doesn't head straight to Jerusalem as Cestius Gallus did. He decided he was going to take his time. And so he entered into the north of Israel, into the area of Galilee, and his plan was going to work his way down southward until he got to Jerusalem. And as he worked his way down, his plan was to conquer and destroy and to kill, essentially to put these Jews in their place. And so he enters into Galilee in the north, and his first major battle is at a place called Yodfat, or also known as Yotapata. And this is the interesting point, because we have to stop at this point of the story to mention a man called Josephus. I'm sure many of you have heard of Josephus. He is a historian. And he was a historian. Most of the things that I've been sharing with you have come from the writings of Josephus. He's the one who gives us all the details about this time period, and indeed for an extended history of the Jews. A very prolific writer in terms of history, and particularly in this period that we're dealing with now. And I mention him now because when Vespasian enters Israel and comes to Yodfat, he is confronted by an army there to protect and to defend Yodfat. And that army is led by none other than our friend Josephus. And so Josephus enters the story now. He is not just a chronicler, a historian who is doing research and putting things together from his research. He is now an active member of the story. And so the things that he has told us from this point are given from a first-person perspective, one who was actually involved in the conflict. And indeed, he was the leader of the Jewish army that faced off Vespasian at Yodfat. And so I thought I mentioned that because the writings that we've had, all the things we have, come from this man who was an integral part of the actual story. On our next and final class, I propose to do a brief biography of Josephus, because it is very interesting to know something about the man. And so we'll save that to the next class. But suffice it to say at this point, there's a conflict at Yophat. Vespasian and his men, obviously, his 60,000 strong army overwhelmed the Jews at that point. And to make a long story short, Josephus himself survives and ends up joining the Romans and working for the Romans. Essentially, you might say becoming a traitor to the Jews and ended up working with the enemy. We'll get into that story a bit in our next class. And so Vespasian comes in. He assaults Jotapata, also known as Yophat, kills many people, moves on, working his way southward. And it is a bloodbath. If we are to believe and accept the numbers of Josephus, thousands and thousands of Jews are killed by Vespasian's army. Either Josephus was very bad at estimating numbers, or there was significant and unbelievable level of death that occurred at that time. Just town after town, city after city, overwhelmed, destroyed, thousands and thousands slaughtered by Vespasian and his army. Bodies thrown into the River Jordan. It is said that those cities who were downstream of the river would know that Vespasian was coming, and they would know that because they would see the bodies floating down the river. Tremendous suffering, tremendous persecution, tremendous tribulation by those people in Israel at that time. And many died. Not only that, but many of them, because of the threat of Vespasian coming, left their cities, left their homes, and fled into Jerusalem. Now remember the words of the Lord Jesus. He said that at this time you should be fleeing away from Jerusalem. But these people did not know that, or had not heard that, or had heard it but chose to ignore it. And so because they thought that Jerusalem was a safe place with its big walls, its well protected environment, and because they had food in Jerusalem, they figured that was a place of safety. So many people fled from their homes in the cities and towns round about and fled into Jerusalem, expecting it to be a place of safety for them. And so Vespasian keeps coming. However, in around AD 68, again, if you can recall from an earlier lesson, there is some conflict in Rome itself. Nero dies, and by die I mean he was executed, or he was forced to execute himself. And after Nero dies, there's a period of turmoil where there are three other emperors who are seeking to get three other persons successively who became emperors for very short periods, a very unstable period. And that's in 68 when it first started, and then went into 69, which you will recall I mentioned 69 was the year of the four emperors. And while all this was going on, Vespasian obviously had one eye on events in Rome. And eventually in 69, after Galba, Otho, Vitellius, the army called Vespasian to come and sort things out in Rome. And so Vespasian put his assault on the Jews on hold, took the majority of his army, headed back to Rome, defeated Vitellius, and became emperor of Rome. Before doing that, he left his son and second in command, Titus, in charge. And he probably gave Titus a few instructions as to what he should do when he continued the battle. And one thing he said to Titus was, Titus, son, listen to me carefully. When you get to Jerusalem, please do not destroy the city. And please, Titus, for heaven's sake, do not destroy the temple. That temple is a fantastic building. We could probably use that for service to one of our gods. So whatever you do, do not destroy the temple. And of course, Titus responded, sure thing, Dad. Don't worry about it. I got you covered. Leave it to me. And so Vespasian heads back to Rome, and Titus heads down directly to Jerusalem. And that's where the battle culminates. So now Titus heads his army and they head straight to Jerusalem. Now, as I mentioned earlier, Vespasian took most of his soldiers, his well-trained, disciplined soldiers that were loyal to him, he took them with him back to Rome to conquer and defeat Vitellius and become emperor. So Titus was left with a small number of trained soldiers, and so he had to get reinforcements from areas, the surrounding areas like Syria, for example, and other areas around it. He had to get soldiers, and these men were not as well trained, not as disciplined as the Romans. Nevertheless, Titus is able to raise an army of about 80,000 soldiers, and he heads to Jerusalem. Now, the state in Jerusalem at the time is, of course, one of turmoil. Jerusalem is bursting at the seams because there are now all these people from all the towns that we mentioned before had now come into Jerusalem, and they're now confined in Jerusalem. And according to Josephus, he estimated that at this time there were 1.2 million Jews in Jerusalem at this time. 1.2 million Jews. Bear in mind, zero or close to zero Christians, because they have all left. And so these 1.2 million people gathering in Jerusalem are seeking shelter, are seeking a haven of protection from the Roman army. And the state of the environment is still very unstable. There's still infighting going on among the Jews themselves, and to the point where they did some really ridiculous things. Now, Jerusalem had a lot of food stored up, a lot of grain stored up, and these grain stores were controlled by one particular sect or the other. And again, I would have mentioned to you in the last class how the sects were constantly fighting against each other, almost to the point, and indeed often to the point, of physical war between themselves. And so one of the things that these groups did is that they burned each other's store of grain. And so all the food, all the grain that was stored in Jerusalem that would have allowed them to wait out a siege was burned in this conflict between warring Jewish factions. So now the food is gone. Titus comes down and he immediately forms a siege again around the city, him and his 80,000 men. And he decides that he's going to wait for a little bit and allow them to starve, because no food can get in, no one can get out. They've burned their supplies of food, and so the only logical conclusion is that they will starve. And indeed starve they did, many of them. After about a 2-week wait, Titus forces into past the first wall, and indeed Jerusalem had multiple walls. They had the outer wall and then inner walls. And it wasn't easy to get through these walls. They were well built, well defended, and but like I said, there were 80,000 Romans, and there were about an estimated 25,000 Jewish rebels inside Jerusalem fighting. And so after a while, and again you can read the details, Josephus provides some excellent details as to exactly what was done. There was some great fighting by the rebels, the Jewish rebels. Even at one point they made a surprise assault on Titus's men whilst they were in the siege, and a quite successful one as well. However, the numbers were totally unsustainable. 80,000 on one side, 25,000 on the other side. The odds were totally against the Jews. And so Titus just had to wait, by this time, wait for the starvation to kick in, and then make his assault, which he did. And so he assaulted around what would now be late August in 70 AD. The Roman army breached the walls of Jerusalem, came into the city, ransacked the city, kills many Jews, destroys the temple. The temple is totally burned down. And the words of the Lord Jesus came to pass exactly as he said. Not one stone was left upon another of the temple. Exactly as the Lord prophesied. So you would recall that I mentioned that in Jerusalem at this time, there were, according to Josephus, approximately 1.2 million people in the city. And of those, 1.1 million were killed and 90,000 were taken into captivity. A tremendous massacre and disaster for the city. The city is destroyed, the temple is destroyed, and as the story according to Josephus is that Titus himself was not in favor of destroying the temple, but because the soldiers he had under his command were not as disciplined and well trained as the previous Roman soldiers that were led by his father, they kind of ran wild when they got into the place. We don't know if that's true or not. What we do know is absolutely true. The city was destroyed. Millions, or at least many hundreds of thousands of Jews were killed. Many were enslaved. And that seemed to be the end of an era in Jewish history. Now you will recall as well that I did mention that Vespasian, when he was handed over to Titus and putting him in charge, advised him or instructed him not to destroy the city and not to destroy the temple. Obviously, that command wasn't obeyed, and the city and the temple were destroyed. According to Josephus again, that was contrary to Titus's own wishes. Titus wanted to preserve the temple, but because of the soldiers were, as we mentioned before, not as disciplined as the elite Romans that Vespasian had, they kind of run amok. They were unruly, and they went ahead and destroyed the city, destroyed the temple, contrary to Titus's instructions and wishes. At least that's Titus's story, and I guess he's sticking to it. Now the war did continue for a bit after this, even though this was really the climax of the war, but the actual fighting did continue for 3 or 4 years after. There was one notable battle which I'm sure many of you have heard of, the battle at a place called Masada, where a number of rebels were holed up in what was then a fortress. You remember that Masada was initially a palace that Herod built, but the Jews turned it into a fortress. And a number of them were holed up there, and they resisted the Romans for quite a long time. Again, you can read the full story of how the Romans eventually were able to break in. And actually, you must really admire the Romans for their ingenuity in what they were able to do, because Masada was really a very difficult place to get to, and it was thought to be pretty much impenetrable. But the Romans used quite some ingenious engineering methods and were able to eventually break in to Masada. The rebels who were held up there decided, according to Josephus, that they would not surrender and they would not be taken captive by the Romans, and so they all committed suicide. And so that's the story of Masada, which I'm sure many of you have heard. And the war ended, according to some estimates, either in 73 or 74 AD. The Romans apparently were quite pleased with this victory, and they built a whole celebratory Ark of Triumph in honor of Titus. And the Ark of Titus is still standing today in the Via Sacra in Rome. You can go there and visit and have a look. But they built that in order to celebrate their victory over the Jews. Here are my closing thoughts. I found very striking the story of how the Christians that were living in Jerusalem at that time heeded the words of the Lord Jesus when he said to them that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, then you should flee. And even though initially it looked to them as though those words didn't make sense, eventually they saw that it did indeed make sense, and they heeded those words. And because they heeded those words, their lives were spared. They lived. This is a striking illustration of the words of the Lord Jesus being words of life. Words that if we heed them, they lead to life. If we ignore them, it leads to death. And those 1.2 million Jews, maybe they had never heard the words of the Lord Jesus. Maybe they heard and rejected it because they didn't think it made sense to them, but they didn't act on those words. and they ended up either dead or enslaved. This to me is a powerful illustration. The words of the Lord Jesus are words of life. You heed his words and you live. You ignore his words and there's death. The early Christians of the first century lived this out in a real manner. Because they heeded his words, they lived. But for those 1.2 million who did not heed the words, we have to think, well, maybe no one told them. Maybe no one told them, hey, Jesus said that when you see Jerusalem surrounded by armies, you got to flee. You got to leave Jerusalem. And those of you who were outside and living in the towns around, don't go to Jerusalem because Jesus said so. Maybe no one told them. And that is a challenge to us Christians today. Because we have the words of life. We know the words of life. We know the words to live by. The words of the Lord Jesus. But there's still many who have not heard. There's still many who need to be told. And it is our job to get them the message. The message of the gospel. The words of the Lord Jesus Christ. That he said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. No man cometh unto the Father but by me. He's the one who said, call unto me and be saved. And so we need to get those words out. The people so that they can hear the words of life and be saved. We trust that this story, this true story, this historical event would have been enlightening to you and would have encouraged you of the need to spread the word and the words of the Lord Jesus Christ. Next class is our final class in this series. And as I said, I'll just be sharing with you some information about Josephus, the historian who we owe a lot of this information to. A very interesting character and one who I think we can learn some lessons from as well. So I will see you in the next class, and until then, God bless you.